I think when we can trace the history of Māori journalism back to pre-European days, and I think that's a very important thing as well, to perhaps broaden our understanding of journalism as something that only arrived with Europeans or only developed much later, because there were systems of public news communications far before that, and that's the same case in all traditional societies, indigenous societies. In those societies, there were storytellers, orators, and singers who were primarily responsible for spreading news in these regions. And Māori have a very similar tradition established long before Pākehā settlement. A Māori broadcaster, Tainu Stevens, for example, believes that the origins of Māori news and drama lie in the culture's tradition of storytelling, and that those who work in the media today are merely the newest branch of a very old family tree. He's referring to the Kei Kōrero, who were the traditional orators, highly talented and rigorously trained in the arts of communication, and they were partly responsible for the delivery of news to the various tribal groups. They interpreted the world they knew and observed for the benefit of their people, and some argue that whai kōrero, which are the actual orations, so there's a slight word difference there, had an entirely different structure to what is regarded as journalism today, but I think we can see some similarities in terms of the way that stories were told and what kinds of stories were told as well, and the kind of function they had in a society of creating a public sphere. Printing presses, of course, didn't exist before the Pākehā arrived, and the first newspaper in the country was established by the Europeans only 4 months after the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840. The first Māori language newspaper, though, followed very, very soon after, in 1842 already, on the 1st of January, when Ko te karere o Nui te Reni, which is translated as the Messenger of New Zealand, began publishing. Its purpose was so that the Māori people would come to know the ways and customs of the Pākehā, and the Pākehā would also come to know the customs of the Māori people. So the intention arguably was to help each other understand each other, but really a lot of the research has shown it was purely for colonising purposes, to really sort of tell the indigenous population, you know, how to live in a British society. It was published monthly for 4 years, but then the governor, George Grey, cancelled production, most likely to save costs. Many other titles followed, which were also used for colonising purposes, but at the same time, the Māori language newspapers, even though they were controlled by Europeans, carried on cultural traditions of communications. They were basically carried over to newspapers through the publication of letters and debates. One interesting thing I thought was that newspapers took the names of birds who were regarded as winged messengers and represented qualities similar to the Kei Kōrero, who were colloquially known as manu kōrero, which translates as talking birds. And so the newspapers adopted these sort of bird metaphors to be the new messengers. And that took on great symbolic importance, with editors using these metaphors to, for example, drive for their drives for donations. So the editor of one newspaper asked for supplejack berries for our birds, to sort of use metaphors and really wordplays to try to generate help for the newspaper and get funding. And these newspapers were an important vehicle in the continuation of Māori culture and the documentation of Māori culture as well, of course. And the customs and values by connecting people with one another, and also early contributions to a national Māori identity, because they could be used for political agitation, which happened later on in the 60s, when we actually had, 1860s, when we had Māori-controlled newspapers. But something that was very difficult was, these newspapers never really lived for long before that because they depended on donations. In 1862, so 22 years after the first newspaper was established in the country, we are actually seeing the first Maori-controlled newspaper. And immediately the main purpose was for political activism. It was to assert Maori rights. It was to really sort of try to fight the government. At that time there were very volatile relations in the Waikato region, and war did break out later. They did it with help from the Austrians, actually. The Austrian emperor, who gave them a printing press, because two Maori chiefs travelled to Austria when a ship arrived in New Zealand. They travelled back to Vienna, and they were instructed in printing by a local staff member there who could amazingly speak Maori. So they would come back with a printing press, and it was the Maori's own printing press that they could use to put out their own newspapers, which is called Te Hokioi o Nuturini e Rere Atuna, which translates the Hokioi, which is a now extinct giant eagle of New Zealand who flies out. So again, the bird metaphor was being used for these newspapers. So it advocated for the Maori King movement that existed at the time and the restriction of government influence over Maori. A rival newspaper, which also took on the name of a bird, Te Pihoihoi Moke Moke, came up established by the government, and there was a real paper war between the two, and the editorials were fighting each other, and actually eventually warriors went to Te Pihoihoi and took over and stole their printing press and destroyed it. And Te Hokioi, though, didn't survive for very long itself because the war broke out very soon after. But it was a first attempt by Māori to really establish their own media and tell their own news stories and their own general stories by having complete control over their own publications. Other newspapers again followed. I would argue it's an important cornerstone in the development of Māori journalism because they provided the space controlled by Māori. From 1913, however, there was a very strong decline in the number of Māori language newspapers, and we actually see them completely disappear, partly because of funding issues, but also because there were fewer and fewer speakers, because the regulations at schools were introduced, where the inspector of native schools in 1905 determined that school children should be encouraged to speak only English when at school. While that was only an instruction and encouragement, that was actually interpreted into a general prohibition of the Māori language within school precincts. And so, the language simply disappeared for the next 5 decades, as Ranginui Walker argues in his history of Māori people. For the next 5 decades, the prohibition was in some instances enforced by corporal punishment. So journalism actually, and any sort of Māori media, disappeared for the next at least 40-50 years. Radio arrived in Aotearoa in 1922, but it took 5 years for even just the first Māori songs to be heard on radio. And until 1936, for the first broadcast to be made in Māori language. The first weekly news bulletins in Māori actually only started during the Second World War, because Māori were asking for news about a lot of their family members who were fighting in Europe, and they wanted to know what was going on. And so these first sort of very, very short news bulletins were being broadcast. And again, however, it was really only a transliteration of the English news services. So it wasn't really a Māori controlled space. There was a Māori speaker, a Māori announcer, but it wasn't really Māori news. By 1973, there was only one Māori news bulletin and one current affairs program a week, plus 45 minutes of other Māori content, mostly sort of cultural content. But then, as I mentioned before, in the 1970s and 80s, we started seeing the increased agitation, for rights, the establishment of the Waitangi Tribunal in 1975, and that really saw a re-emergence of various Maori print publications which were fiercely pro-Maori and continued that tradition of these newspapers in the 19th century. During the early 1990s, we had about 13 newspapers and magazines, but again, they all struggled for financial survival because they could not get government funding. While broadcast received government funding, these newspapers could not, because there was a belief there that broadcast, the language, it was much about the oral nature of the language. It was more important to fund broadcast, radio and later television. And so print publications have always struggled, and there are really only 2 or 3 magazines today. In broadcasting, however, we saw a significant progress. The first television news program produced for and by Māori was in 1982, when Derek Fox produced a 2-minute nightly news bulletin in Māori during Māori Language Week, which is sort of to celebrate the language that sort of started around that time as well, when there was this movement for revitalisation of the language. And so they produced this short bulletin, and it was a huge success and became a regular institution because people were really craving for this information, and Māori really wanted to see news more in their own language and from their own perspective as well. The journalist Wena Harawira, who is very prominent as well, has noted that this show, Te Karere, which has been the longest running news program that still screens today, and is a half an hour long with an advertising break, so maybe 22 minutes of pure content, still much better than the 2 or 4 minutes at the time. That's really been really important in shaping the language as well, and creating new words that was sort of a mix out of the Pākehā terms and incorporated into Māori. Really important development happened in 1986 when the Waitangi Tribunal ruled that the language, Te Reo Māori, the Māori language, was a treasured possession that was covered under the Treaty of Waitangi and had to be supported, actively supported, by the government. And that is really the foundation now, today, of Māori media. In 1988, the first Māori-controlled radio station emerged, one in Wellington and later on one in Auckland. Today we have a tribal radio system there of 21 stations around the country. I've put up Radio Wate out there because it produces the syndicated news service that is being broadcast on all the tribal stations around the country. And so they're the main producers of news content. Some of the individual stations also produce their own content. There was an increasing push for television as well, and it had arrived in New Zealand in the 1960s, but it took until 2004 for the first Māori-owned, Māori-controlled television station, which I guess a lot of you are familiar with, Māori television, that has sort of really been a beacon, I would argue, for Indigenous television and journalism around the world. It broadcasts nearly 8 hours of programming, that's how it started, broadcast nearly 8 hours of programming a day. And in 2008, its channel Te Reo is a 100% Māori language channel. And that started in 2008. And it's really had a profound impact on Māori journalism by offering more avenues for content and even competition with Te Karere. I noticed when I interviewed journalists, there was a lot of competition between journalists from Māori television and journalists from Television New Zealand, where Te Karere is screened, because they're both competing for the same market. And some people argue that it's a good thing because competition makes people strive harder, and other people say it's a waste of resources because you could spend, could put all the money into one and make it a much better program. So there are really two sides to that coin, I guess. Māori TV's current affairs program, Native Affairs, has won a number of awards, including the Best Current Affairs program on, in the country in 2008, I think it was. Or 2011, sorry. The Aotearoa Film and Television Awards. And there's now also a current affairs program purely in Māori, because Native Affairs is actually mostly in English. And just to sort of finish off, I guess, I want to introduce you to a few dimensions that I've identified by looking at the history of Māori journalism and also studies that have been conducted on Indigenous journalism elsewhere around the world, in terms of the sort of dimensions that we can see in Indigenous and in particular